Hello, I'm Pastor David Shue from Trinity West Bend, and I welcome you again to Through the Bible in a Year. For those who are counting, this is week number 3 in the series. A couple of things before we begin. First of all, I'm sorry to those who were looking around for this last week. We had to take a week off. My wife was having knee surgery, so we didn't film this last week. There were those who talked to me afterwards then and said, but how are we going to get through the Bible in a year then? So this week what I'll be doing is kind of doubling up some of the material. Now I know for some people that may mean that this seems like an awful lot. But this is a marathon, not a sprint. So if somehow you feel like this is too much material for you to do in one week, then feel free to cut this in half for each day and take this as 2 weeks. And then you can pick it up in week 4 as week 5 for you then, and continue on from there. There's no pressure to finish this in a year, but I did want to be responsive to those who felt like they really did want to finish getting through the Bible in a year. The second thing I want to apologize for is we didn't have a slide on the video last time that gave you the Bible verses to study for that particular week. That was because I didn't get material to the film editor in time. And so this week we hope we'll have that corrected and people will be able to pick that up. I also hope to have on the website just a list of all the readings for each week so that people can go there and pick those up without necessarily have to copying them all off the video. You can find that at trinitywestbend.com. So if you would like to just look up the list there, hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll have a list of all the readings there on the website. So on to this week's readings. In the Old Testament, you'll be reading from the book of Genesis and then going on to the book of Exodus. And in the New Testament, you'll continue on in the book of Matthew. On day 1, you'll be reading Genesis 36 through 40 and Matthew 10:21 through the end of chapter 11. On day 2, you'll read Genesis 41 through 45 and the 12th chapter of the book of Matthew. On day 3, you'll read Genesis 46 through 50 and the 13th chapter of Matthew. On day 4, you'll read Exodus chapters 1 through 6 and Matthew 14. On day 5, you'll read Exodus 7 through 11 and Matthew 15. On day 6, you'll read Exodus 12 through 15 and Matthew 16 and 17. And on day 7, you'll read Exodus 16 through 20 and Matthew 18. So, given that, let's take a few minutes just to look at each section and give you kind of a quick run through of what you're going to run into in each of those sections. First of all, in the book of Genesis. Unfortunately, this section of the book of Genesis starts with a genealogy. I know everybody's getting to love these genealogies. This one is a genealogy of Jacob's brother Esau. God hasn't forgotten Isaac's other son, the one who's not at the center of the story. And as we see in this chapter, Esau too is blessed with many descendants. And I think that's one of the primary reasons for this genealogy. Also within Israel's history, these descendants will play mixed roles in Israel's future. You'll notice that one of the primary centers of this genealogy is Edom. And that represents the beginning of the nation of Edom, who will at times be an ally of Israel, and also will end up at times betraying Israel. In the future, many of the prophets will condemn Edom for its relationship with Israel. And so this becomes an important relationship, and we see that this rocky relationship between Jacob and Esau carries on and has national consequences in the future as well. To us today, these genealogies can seem long and tedious, but to the people of that day, reading them was a chance to consider the connections of history and to ask that question that plagues all of us: where was God in the midst of all of this? Now we get into a soap opera sort of story about Joseph and his family. We start with a dysfunctional family. Jacob, a father, who's playing favorites among his sons. Joseph, the favorite son, who has a tendency to brag and annoy everyone else in his family. And his group of jealous brothers, who finally have it in for poor Joseph. The thing is, it's interesting to note that God works through families like this, works through people like this. The truth is, if God only has sinful people to work through, then God does have to work through people like this. If all of us are flawed and frail, then God has a limited choice in who God can work his will through. So Joseph's brothers, sick to death of his bragging and his specialness in his father's eyes, decide they want to kill him. But his oldest brother, Reuben, really isn't on board with this. So instead he talks his brothers not into killing him directly, but let's just throw him in a pit, and that'll allow time itself to take care of him rather than we ourselves. And he has the idea that he'll come back later and get Joseph out of the pit and rescue him. The problem is, while Reuben's back is turned, his other brothers see a group of slave traders in the distance and decide, well, we might as well make a little money off the whole deal. And they sell Joseph to the slave traders. So when Reuben returns, his brother's gone. The brothers then all decide to take Joseph's brightly colored coat that his father has given him, dip it in some lamb's blood, and tell their father that he's been attacked by a lion and killed. And so they think that they are rid of their brother for good. Chapter 38 then becomes a bit of an interlude in the story, again showing that the sons of Jacob are far from perfect, and that God sometimes works through some interesting processes to get things done. This chapter also requires that we understand a little bit of the customs of the time if we're really going to understand what's going on in this chapter. The chapter begins with Jacob's son Judah taking a wife. They give birth to 3 sons. The oldest, gets married to a woman named Tamar. But he's not a nice person. And so God decides that Er's life should end. Now Tamar is left a widow, and according to the law of the land, his brother is supposed to take Tamar as his wife, and the first of their sons would be considered Er's son, so that his line wouldn't end with his death. The problem is that his next brother, Onan, really doesn't want to have a child that's not his own. And so the Bible so indelicately puts it that Onan pours his semen on the ground so that he doesn't conceive a child. This also is against God's ordinance and against God's will, and so Onan ends up dying. Now, Judah has one more son, too young to get married at this particular time, and so he promises Tamar that when his last son is old enough, he will give him to her as her husband. But he reneges on the deal. Tamar, in an attempt to get what's rightfully hers, poses as a prostitute, tricks Jacob to go to bed with her, or Judah to go to bed with her, and when the child is born, Judah wants to accuse her of being a prostitute. She has proof that it is actually his son, and that this was all to get what was rightfully hers. And so, through a strange set of circumstances, God takes care of Tamar and brings about what needs to be done. And in the end, she has twins who wrestle on the way out of her womb. And we see a little bit of the story of Jacob and Esau being replayed in this little drama that takes place in chapter 38. Now back to Joseph, who is now sold as a slave in Egypt. He's sold to a high official in the land of Egypt, and his work prospers due to his life being blessed by God. The problem is that this official's wife takes a shine to poor Joseph and tries to seduce him. He refuses, being a moral person. She accuses him of trying to rape her, and Joseph is thrown into prison. The question might be asked at this point, where is God in the midst of all this? This seems wholly unfair. But the story's not over. In prison, Joseph is such a model prisoner that the jailer puts him in charge of everything in the prison. He rises to the top of the prison population there. And while he's there, 2 of Pharaoh's servants are sent off to prison with him. They have dreams, and it turns out that one of God's gifts is that Joseph can interpret dreams. He interprets their dreams for them, tells one of them that he will be returned to Pharaoh's service, and he tells the other that he'll be executed. The prophecies come to pass, and Joseph asks that the one servant remember him when he's returned to his job, and he promptly forgets Joseph. Now Pharaoh has a dream, and all of his advisors in the land can't tell him what it means. Suddenly, this servant remembers Joseph, who is in prison. He tells the Pharaoh about this young man who can interpret dreams. Joseph is brought before the Pharaoh, interprets his dreams as a warning that a time of famine is about to come, and the Pharaoh should prepare for it. The Pharaoh, realizing that Joseph is a sharp person, blessed by God, makes him the second in command in the land. So God has brought Joseph now to a particularly important place in the land of Egypt, a place where he can make a difference. And this sets up the stage for the coming finale. Now Joseph's brothers are driven to Egypt to look for food during this famine time and come before Joseph and do not recognize him as their brother. He runs them through a series of trials to see if they've really learned their lesson over the years. Finally, he can bear it no longer and reveals himself. And in a tearful reconciliation, as they stand before him at his mercy, he gives us what may be the central message of this entire story. He says, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." It's God who's at work in all things, working for the good of his people and for all people. And so Joseph's family, at the end of the story, is brought to Egypt and given a portion of the land to live on. And this movement, too, is placed in the context of God at work. The move is blessed by God, and Jacob is reassured that God goes with him still. Again, we get another genealogy. I know this is rough, but this one establishes the beginning of the 12 tribes of Israel. Establishes that this is how these sons of Jacob become the very beginning of a structure for the people of Israel. It becomes a central image within the identity of God's people. The image of 12 tribes will run through the Old Testament and on into the New Testament. So this is a particularly important section for the people to have had within their scripture. Joseph continues to cement his relationship with Pharaoh, expanding his power and influence. And in the midst of it all, Jacob prepares to die. A part of the movement of life is once more reflected here. He makes his family promise that they'll return him to his homeland, to bury him. As he prepares to die, Joseph brings his 2 sons to Jacob, and he blesses them, and they become a part of the structure of the 12 tribes of Israel as well. Instead of Joseph as a tribe, both of his sons will be represented there. And Levi will become not so much a separate tribe as a part of all the tribes, the priestly tribe that'll carry on the spirituality of the people of Israel. Then Jacob, unlike his father, blesses not just one son, but all 12 of his sons. It appears Jacob has learned an important lesson over the years. Jacob dies. He's buried in his home country. Jacob dies and is buried in his home country by his sons and by dignitaries from Egypt. Joseph's brothers are now afraid that now that their father's dead, there's nothing keeping them safe from Joseph's wrath. But once again, Joseph expresses what is the center of this story. He says to his brothers, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and for your little ones." And the story ends with Joseph dying and his plea that his bones are returned home for burial, a request that will wait many years. This leads directly into the book of Exodus. Exodus is the central story of the Jewish identity. It's the story of God's saving acts. The Exodus account establishes who God is and who the people of Israel are as well. The story begins in Egypt, many years after the story we heard of Joseph. In fact, it has been so many years that the Pharaoh, who now is in charge of Egypt, can't even remember who Joseph is. All this king knows is that there are too many Israelites and that they are a threat to Egyptian security. If there's a war and they throw in with Egypt's enemies, they could make the difference. And so the Israelites are made slaves and hope that hard labor will somehow decrease their numbers and make them too weak to make a difference in any war. But this doesn't seem enough to the king. And so he also orders the midwives of the Israelites that they are to deliver any baby girl normally, but any baby boy they are to kill. The midwives realize how wrong this is, and so they refuse to do so and tell the king that Israelite women are so hardy that by the time they get there, they don't need anyone to deliver their babies. And so they manage to circumvent the will of the king. And for this, they are blessed by God. But the king doesn't stop there. Instead, he orders all Egyptians to take every baby boy of Israel and throw it into the Nile. Many compare these to other stories where slaves try to circumvent the will of their masters. Now we get into that part of the story that's been portrayed in Hollywood so many times, the Ten Commandments, Prince of Egypt. A woman and her husband have a child. And in hopes of protecting him from the genocide that's going on, they place him in a reed basket, float him down the Nile River. They send his sister, Miriam, to watch over him. The basket floats to where the daughter of the king is taking a bath. She sees the basket, finds the child, and adopts him as her own. Miriam then pops out of the reeds and says she knows exactly where the baby can go and be nursed. And so the princess puts the baby in charge of his own natural mother until he's weaned and ready to go to the palace. She names the child Moses. Moses sees his people brutally beaten over the years. And at one point, an Israelite is being beaten savagely by an Egyptian overseer. Moses, interceding, kills the overseer. He hopes that no one sees him, but it becomes clear that he was seen. The Pharaoh, upon hearing it, chooses to try to kill Moses, and so Moses flees into the wilderness. In the wilderness, Moses defends some female shepherds from harassment by other shepherds, and ends up marrying one of them and finds a place in her family. But the oppression of God's people gets worse. And one of the chapters ends with a refrain we will hear throughout many sections of Exodus. God heard the groanings of his people, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Sometimes it seems that God has forgotten us. But the assurance throughout the Bible is that God does see, and that God does hear. And ultimately, as we see in Jesus Christ, and we'll hear later in the book of Exodus, God comes down to share with us, to deliver us. And so begins God's salvation here. As Moses tends the flock of his father-in-law, he comes upon a striking sight, a burning bush that is not consumed by the fire. God identifies his presence, and again the words central to the understanding of God in Exodus are repeated. I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of this land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, in the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. The word know here is one that means more than just intellectually knowing. God knows in God's deepest heart and being what the Israelites are going through. And God gives Moses his name, Yahweh. The one I am who I am, it gets translated in the Bible oftentimes. But it seems to be even more than that. I am known by what I do and who I am. A name is a powerful thing in a culture. A name gives someone the power to call on someone. And so God is entrusting his name to his people. God, to a certain extent, gives them a claim on God. But God gives Moses his name so his people know that he is with them. Moses, however, is still reluctant to take on the job of going to be God's representative to deliver his people. He makes excuses and tries to find a way out, and God finally even gets angry with Moses and tells him, look, I'm giving you everything you need. You are going. He gives him powers. He gives him a staff of authority. He gives him his brother to go along. And as Moses heads back home and tells his family he is heading for Egypt to check on his people, he is filled with the promise that God will be with him. So Moses heads out. Now God warns him that this won't be easy. Pharaoh will not listen, and he will need some convincing. And then we get one of the strangest passages, at least from a modern perspective, when God almost kills Moses. It says, on the way, at a place where they spent the night, the Lord met him and tried to kill him. But Zipporah, that's Moses' wife, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it, and said, truly, you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then, she said, a bridegroom of blood by circumcision. Now Moses, the representative of God, either hasn't been circumcised or hasn't circumcised his son, which was the requirement of those who were Israelites, who followed God. And this kind of disregard for God's commandment was a part of not showing the proper respect to God. And we might not fully appreciate this. But again, Moses is saved by the action of another, just as he was as a child. And God is a holy God. And we can't forget that easily, I think this passage reminds us. Moses is then met by his brother Aaron, who helps him convince the Israelites of his place as God's representative. And finally, it is with great joy that they realize that God has heard them and that God is with them. So now it's time for the confrontation with Pharaoh. Moses goes to Pharaoh and asks, not at first to let the people go, but just to let them go into the wilderness to worship. But Pharaoh has no regard for Moses' God and refuses. And what's more, he makes it even more difficult for the Israelites. He cuts their amount of straw they're given to make bricks. Now, it's impossible to make bricks without this straw, and so it makes the Israelite burden even heavier. And Moses begins to doubt whether he's doing any good at all at this point. But God again assures him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they resided as aliens. I have also heard the groanings of the Israelites, who the Egyptians are holding as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians, and deliver you from slavery in them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with a mighty act of judgment. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has freed you from the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. Moses told this to the Israelites, but they would not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and their cruel slavery. And then Dret, another genealogy. This time the leadership of Israel is laid out. These are the people who Moses and Aaron must convince. And these are the people who must help them lead the people out. The question is, will they? And Moses asks the difficult question, since I am a poor speaker, why would Pharaoh listen? And then we get into the famous battle between Pharaoh and Moses. God sends a series of plagues upon Egypt to force Pharaoh into letting the people go. 7 plagues come to the Egyptians, each seeming to increase the pressure on Pharaoh to change his mind. Now these plagues are interesting in that they're not just a battle between Pharaoh and Moses, but between Moses' God and the God of the Egyptians. Because each of the things represents an attack on the gods that Egypt worships. They have a god of the Nile, and the Nile is changed to blood. The gods of fertility and the crops are attacked as the crops are attacked. As the sun is wiped out, the god of the sun, Ra, is attacked by the presence of God. Each of the things that Egypt is worshipped is slowly worn down by the power of Israel's God. This shows that in the end it is Israel's God that has the power. And finally, the firstborn of the Egyptians are killed while the Israelites are saved by an act of the blood of lambs placed upon their doorpost. Sacrifice becomes a central image within Israelites' thinking. Oftentimes blood is necessary to set one free. And so finally, Pharaoh allows the people to go. But as we know, he doesn't allow that to happen easily. He changes his mind, chases them to the edge of the Red Sea. God opens the sea to deliver his people and closes the sea to destroy Pharaoh's army. We are given songs of joy and celebration as the people are set free. And then in the last chapter that you read for this week, Moses ascends the mountain and receives the 10 Commandments, a covenant between God and God's people. It's interesting to note as you read these commandments that it begins not with God saying, if you do these things, then I will be your God. But that God has already freed them from the land of Egypt. God has claimed them as his people and now calls his people to this new life that he offers them. What we'll ask in the next few chapters is, will they hear the call? Now we turn to Matthew. In Matthew, Jesus continues to instruct those who are sent out into the world. He's honest and clear that those who carry on his mission will often find themselves at odds with the world. Even sometimes with members of their own family, they will find themselves at odds. Many have wondered if church's relative acceptance in our culture is a sign that we're not really following the mission, because we don't seem to find that kind of opposition that Jesus spoke of. I'm not sure of that, but I do know that Jesus calls on those who follow him to be unafraid to stand up for the power of the kingdom and to trust God to empower them and guide them for the work that is to come. And Jesus calls us to put the kingdom before everything else in our life. The difficulty of this is sensed as we read these words in Matthew's gospel. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Who then can follow Jesus? By ourselves, no one. It's impossible for us, but for God, nothing is impossible. We are dependent on the power of God and God's Spirit. Can we trust this Jesus? This question is asked for us by none other than John the Baptist. John sends representatives who ask Jesus, are you the one we were looking for, or should we look for another? And Jesus' response is to say, look, see what I do and then decide. Do you trust me? Jesus turns to the crowds and says the same, and then goes on and gives them images of the worst of the world, Sodom and Gomorrah, and says, if they had seen the things that I do, the healing I do, the things that I bring, they certainly would have believed. So how can you doubt? How can we doubt when we see what Christ is willing to do for us? But Jesus hints here and elsewhere that maybe only those who are willing to admit their own weakness, their own vulnerability, their need for healing will be able to accept what he is saying and doing. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. In a world that only understands power and needs for power, Jesus may be hard to understand and to embrace. Jesus continues his ministry of healing, and those who oppose him claim his healing is by the power of the devil. But Jesus outlines how absurd this really is. He says, if evil works against itself, how does it stand? And he goes on to say that the greatest sin of all is to call what God does evil. Jesus then hints at the resurrection and the power to rise anew. And once more says, any other generation would delight in this message, but this one turns its back. At this point, his family comes looking for Jesus, but Jesus claims a new family. All those who would hear and follow his word are his family. Then we have a series of parables in which Jesus teaches. Parables are really incredible when you think about it. They're stories that point us to new understandings of the kingdom of God. Why does Jesus use parables? Why not just come right out and say it plainly for us to hear? Maybe sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes we need pictures. Sometimes we need images to truly understand what's going on. Like in the parable of the sower, think about it for a minute. When you plant things in your garden, you don't go out and just throw seeds everywhere. Oftentimes we carefully place the seeds. Even now with modern technology, when people go out and sow seeds in a field, the seeds are placed very carefully where they go. But in this image we have the sower throwing seeds everywhere. The love of God is cast to all places, to all people. And so we are then left to ask, how do we receive this incredible love that's given to all? In each of the parables, what I think we need to do is let the image wash over us, to think about what it means, to let it sink in some into us. There are also some books, some places online, on YouTube, where you can get modern day representations of the parables. And it's sometimes interesting to see parables in new light, placed in new and modern settings. So you might want to go there and try it out. After the parables, we're again confronted by the power of the kingdom that comes in Jesus. Jesus feeds a multitude, controls a storm. He also heals many people. Again, we come to that struggle. The disciples are still struggling with faith, even in the face of all those things. And we can relate to them because we do the same. Peter steps out on the water and then suddenly begins to sink when he sees the waves there. Water was a powerful image of chaos. When we're surrounded by chaos, it becomes so much harder to believe in the power of God to be with us and to protect us and save us. Again, contrasts are laid out between Pharisees who pay lip service to God and to God's will for them, and to those who honor the deeper calling of love and faithfulness that God seeks. And humbly consider, we have this picture of the humble Canaanite woman who comes and is willing to bow down and even scrape before Jesus to receive the goodness of God. And we are placed as people asking, how do we come into the presence of God? How do we come and hear the words God gives us? And now Jesus turns his face to Jerusalem, and the story begins to focus our attention there. On the mountain of transfiguration, Jesus is transfigured and placed in the midst of the representatives of the law and of the prophets. The disciples again are confused by the entire process. They want to stay there forever. They want to build little huts and stay on the mountains. They're afraid. But Jesus calls them to go down with him and to continue the journey that they must make. He tells them about his death and resurrection that are to come. But the disciples end up arguing over who is the greatest among them. He teaches them about forgiveness, about forgiving one another as they have been forgiven. And Peter asks, well, how many times should we forgive someone? 7 times? 7 being a number of perfection, and Jesus says no. 70 times 7. We are to forgive each other infinitely. And he tells them the story of the unforgiving servant who receives forgiveness of an incredible debt from his master and then refuses to forgive another servant even a small debt. to show us that we have received infinite forgiveness from God. And so we have an obligation, we have a call to forgive one another always. And so we end with these troubling thoughts playing in our minds. And maybe we're as confused as disciples as we come to an end. Now again, I know this is a lot of ground to cover, but don't let it throw you. Just do your best to get through the section. Let the stories flow over you. Like many stories, it only really sinks in the third or fourth or fifth time we hear it. Ask others what they think as you're struggling. Look for commentaries or notes on the stories, or contact me. You can reach me at dshub@trinitywestbend.com. May God bless you as you continue your journey. Let us pray. Lord, we continue to commit ourselves to the reading and the study of your word. Open our minds and our hearts to receive your wisdom and the good news that your love is always at work in our lives, bringing hope, salvation, and joy. Amen.